Chapter 7, Women, Caste and Reform. Have you ever thought of how children lived about 200 years ago? Nowadays, most girls from middle class families go to school and often study with boys. On growing up, many of them go to colleges and universities and take up jobs after that. They have to be adults before they are legally married, and according to law, they can marry anyone they like from any caste and community, and widows can remarry too. All women, like all men, can vote and stand for elections. Of course, these rights are not actually enjoyed by all. Poor people have little or no access to education, and in many families, women cannot choose their husbands. 200 years ago, things were different. Most children were married off at an early age. Both Hindu and Muslim men could marry more than one wife. In some parts of the country, widows were praised if they chose death by burning themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. Women who died in this manner, whether willingly or otherwise, were called sati. Sati means virtuous woman. Women's rights to property were also restricted. Besides, most women had virtually no access to education. In many parts of the country, people believed that if a woman was educated, she would become a widow. Differences between men and women were not the only ones in society. In most regions, people were divided along lines of caste. Brahmins and Kshatriyas considered themselves as upper castes. Other such traders and money lenders, often referred to as Vaishyas, were placed after them. Then came peasants and artisans, such as weavers and potters, referred as Shudras. At the lowest rank were those who labored to keep cities and villages clean and worked at jobs that upper caste considered polluting. That is, it could lead to the loss of caste status. The upper castes also treated many of these groups at the bottom as untouchables. They were not allowed to enter temples, draw water from the wells they used by other upper castes, or bathe in ponds where upper caste bathed. They were seen as inferior human beings. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, many of these norms and perceptions slowly changed. Let us see how this happened. Working towards change. From the early 19th century, we find debates and discussions about social customs and practices taking on a new character. One important reason for this was the development of new forms of communication. For the first time, books, newspapers, magazines, leaflets, and pamphlets were printed. These were far cheaper and far more accessible than the manuscripts that you have read about in class 7. Therefore, ordinary people could read these, and many of them could also write and express their ideas in their own languages. All kinds of issues, social, political, economical, and religious, could now be debated and discussed by men and sometimes by women as well. The discussions could reach out to a wide public and could become linked to movements for social change. These debates were often initiated by Indian reformers and reform groups. One such reformer was Raja Ram Mohan Rai. He founded a reform association known as Brahmo Sabha, later known as Brahmo Samaj, in Calcutta. People such as Ram Mohan Rai are described as reformers because they felt that changes were necessary in society and unjust practices needed to be done away with. They thought that the best way to ensure such changes was by persuading people to give up old practices and adopt new way of life. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was keen to spread the knowledge of Western education in the country and bring about greater freedom and equality for women. He wrote about a way women were forced to bear the burden of domestic work. and confined to the home and the kitchen and not allowed to move out and become educated, changing the lives of widows. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was particularly moved by the problems widows faced in their lives. He began a campaign against the practice of sati. Raja Ram Mohan Rai was well versed in Sanskrit, Persian, and several other Indian and European languages. He tried to show through his writings that the practice of widow burning had no sanction in their ancient text. By the early 19th century, as you have read in chapter 6, many British officials had also begun to criticize Indian traditions and customs. They were therefore more than willing to listen to Ram Mohan Rai, who was reputed to be a learned man. In 1829, sati was banned. The strategy adopted by Ram Mohan Rai was used by later reformers as well. Whenever they wished to challenge a practice that seemed harmful, they tried to find a verse or sentence in the ancient sacred text that supported their point of view. They then suggested that the practice as it existed at present was against earlier traditions. We first tie them down to the pile. Rajaram Mohan Rai published many pamphlets to spread his ideas. Some of these were written as a dialogue between the advocate and critic of a traditional practice. Here is one such dialogue in Sati. Advocate of Sati. Women are by nature of inferior understanding, without resolution, unworthy of trust. Many of them, on the death of their husbands, become desirous of accompanying them, but to remove every chance of their trying to escape from blazing fire, in burning them, we first tie them down to the pile. Opponent of Sati. When did you ever afford them a fair opportunity to exhibiting their natural capacity? How then can you accuse them of want of understanding? If after instruction in knowledge and wisdom a person cannot comprehend or retain what has been taught, we may consider him as deficient. But if you do not educate women, how can you see them as inferior? For instance, one of the most famous reformers, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, used the ancient text to suggest that widows could remarry. His suggestion was adopted by British officials and a law was passed in 1856 permitting widow remarriage. Those who were against the remarriage of widows opposed Vidyasagar and even boycotted him. By the second half of the 19th century, the movement in favor of widow remarriage spread to other parts of the country. In the Telugu speaking areas of the Madras Presidency, Veerasalingam Pantulu formed an association for widow remarriage. Around the same time, young intellectuals and reformers in Bombay pledged themselves to working for the same cause. In the north, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded the reform association called Arya Samaj, also supported widow remarriage. Yet the number of widows who actually remarried remained low. Those who married were not easily accepted in society, and conservative groups continued to oppose the new law. Girls begin to go to school. Many of the reformers felt that education for girls was necessary in order to improve the condition of women. Vidyasagar in Calcutta and many other reformers in Bombay set up schools for girls. When the first schools were opened in the mid 19th century, many people were afraid of them. They feared that schools would take girls away from home, prevent them from doing their domestic duties. Moreover, girls had to travel through public places in order to reach school. Many people felt that this would have a corrupting influence on them. They felt that girls should stay away from public spaces. Therefore, throughout the 19th century, most educated women were taught at home by liberal fathers or husbands. Sometimes women taught themselves. Do you remember what you read about Rash Sundari Devi in your book Social and Political Life last year? She was one of those who secretly learned to read and write in the flickering light of candles at night. In the latter part of the century, schools for girls were established by the Arya Samaj in Punjab and Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra. In aristocratic Muslim households in North India, women learned to read Quran in Arabic. They were taught by women who came home to teach. Some reformers, such as Mumtaz Ali, reinterpreted verses from Quran to argue for women's education. The first Urdu novels began to be written from the late 19th century. Amongst other things, these were meant to encourage women to read about religion and domestic management in a language they could understand. Women write about women. From the early 20th century, Muslim women like the Begums of Bhopal played a notable role in promoting education among women. They founded a primary school for girls at Aligarh. Another remarkable woman, Begum Rokia Sakhawat Hussain, started schools for Muslim girls in Patna and Calcutta. She was a fearless critic of conservative ideas, arguing that religious leaders of every faith accorded an inferior place to women. By the 1880s, Indian women began to enter universities. Some of them trained to be doctors, some became teachers. Many women began to write and publish their critical views on the place of women in society. Tarabai Shinde, a woman educated at home at Pune, published a book, Stri Purush Tulna, a comparison between women and men, criticizing the social differences between men and women. Pandita Ramabai, a great scholar of Sanskrit, felt that Hinduism was oppressive towards women and wrote a book about the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu women. She founded a widows' home at Pune to provide shelter to widows who had been treated badly by their husbands' relatives. Here, women were trained so that they could support themselves economically. Needless to say, all this more than alarmed the Orthodox. For instance, many Hindu nationalists felt that Hindu women were adopting Western ways and that this would corrupt Hindu culture and erode family values. Orthodox Muslims were also worried about the impact of these changes. As you can see, by the end of 19th century, women themselves were actively working for reform. They wrote books, edited magazines, founded schools and training centers, and set up women's associations. From the early 20th century, they formed political pressure groups to push through laws for female suffrage and better health care and education for women. Some of them joined various kinds of nationalist and socialist movements from 1920s. In the 20th century, leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru, Subhash Chandra Bose lent their support to demands for greater equality and freedom for women. Nationalist leaders promised that there would be full suffrage for all women and men after independence. However, till then, they asked women to concentrate on anti British struggles. Once a woman's husband has died. In her book, Stri Purush Tulna, Tarabai Shinde wrote, "Isn't a woman's life as dear to her as yours is to you? It's as if women are meant to be made of something different from men altogether, made from dust from earth or rock or rusted iron, whereas you and your lives are made from the purest gold." You are asking me what I mean. I mean, once a woman's husband has died, what seems to offer her? The barber comes to shave all the curls and hair off her head just to cool your eyes. She is shut out from going to weddings, receptions, and other auspicious occasions that married women go to. And why all these restrictions? Because her husband has died. She is unlucky. Ill fate is written on her forehead. Her face is not to be seen. It's a bad omen. Law against child marriage. With the growth of women's organizations and writings on these issues, the momentum for reform gained strength. People challenged another established custom, that of child marriage. There were a number of Indian legislators in the Central Legislative Assembly who fought to make a law preventing child marriage. In 1929, the Child Marriage Restraint Act was passed without the kind of bitter debates and without the kind of bitter struggles that earlier laws had seen. According to the act, no man below the age of 18 and woman below the age of 16 could marry. Subsequently, these limits were raised to 21 for men and 18 for women. Caste and social reform. Some of the social reformers we have been discussing also criticized caste inequalities. Raja Ram Mohan Rai translated an old Buddhist text that was critical of caste. The Prarthana Samaj adhered to the tradition of bhakti that believed in spiritual equality of all castes. In Bombay, the Paramhans Mandali was founded in 1840 to work for the abolition of caste. Many of these reformers and members of reform associations were people of upper castes. Often in secret meetings, these reformers would violate caste taboos on food and touch in an effort to get rid of hold of caste prejudice in their lives. There were also others who questioned the injustices of the caste social order. During the course of the 19th century, Christian missionaries began setting up schools for tribal groups and lower caste children. These children were thus equipped with some resources to make their way into a changing world. At the same time, the poor began leaving their villages to look for jobs that were opening up in cities. There was work in the factories that were coming up and jobs in municipalities. Think of the new demands of labor this created. Drains had to be dug, roads laid, buildings constructed, and cities cleaned. This required coolies, diggers, carriers, bricklayers, sewage cleaners, sweepers, palanquin bearers, rickshaw pullers. Where did this labor force come from? The poor from the villages and small towns, many of them from low caste, began to moving to the cities where there was a new demand for labor. Some also went to work in plantations in Assam, Mauritius, Trinidad, and Indonesia. Work in the new locations was often very hard, but the people from low caste saw this as an opportunity to get away from oppressive hold that upper caste landowners exercised over their lives and the daily humiliation they suffered. Who could produce shoes? Leather workers have been traditionally held in contempt since they work with dead animals, which are seen as dirty and polluting. During the First World War, however, there was a huge demand for shoes for the armies. Caste prejudice against leather work meant that only the traditional leather workers and shoemakers were ready to supply army shoes, so they could ask for high prices and gain impressive profits. There were other jobs too. The army, for instance, offered opportunities. A number of Mahar people who were regarded as untouchables found jobs in Mahar regiment. The father of Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalit movement, taught at an army school. No place inside the classroom. In the Bombay Presidency, as late as 1829, untouchables were not allowed into even government schools. When some of them pressed hard for that right, they were allowed to sit on the veranda outside the classroom. and listen to the lessons without polluting the room where upper caste boys were taught. Demand for equality and justice. Gradually, by the second half of the 19th century, people from within the non Brahman caste began organizing movements against caste discrimination and demanded social equality and justice. The Satnami movement in central India was founded by Ghasidas, who worked among the leather workers and organized a movement to improve their social status. In eastern Bengal, Haridas Thakur's Matua sect worked among Chandala cultivators. Haridas questioned Brahmanical texts that supported the caste system. In what is present day Kerala, a guru from Esava caste, Sri Narayana Guru, proclaimed the ideals of unity for his people. He argued against treating people unequally on the basis of caste differences. According to him, all humankind belonged to the same caste. One of his famous statements was Oru Jati, Oru Matam, Oru Devam, Manushyanu. One caste, one religion, one God for humankind. All these sects were founded by leaders who came from non Brahman caste and worked amongst them. They tried to change those habits and practices which provoked the contempt of dominant castes. They tried to create a sense of self esteem among the subordinate castes. Gulamgiri. One of the most vocal amongst the low caste leaders was Jyotirao Phule. Born in 1827, he studied in schools set up by Christian missionaries. On growing up, he developed his own ideas about injustices of caste system. He set out to attack the Brahmins' claim that they were superior to others since they were Aryans. Phule argued that the Aryans were foreigners who came from outside the subcontinent and defeated and subjugated the true children of the country, those who had lived here from before the coming of the Aryans. As the Aryans established their dominance, they began looking at the defeated population as inferior, as low caste people. According to Phule, the upper caste had no right to their land and power. In reality, the land belonged to indigenous people, the so called low castes. Phule claimed that before Aryan rule, there existed a golden age when warrior peasants and tilled the land and ruled the Maratha countryside in just and fair ways. He proposed that Shudras or laboring caste and Atishudras, untouchables, should unite to challenge caste discrimination. The Satyashodak Samaj, an association Phule founded, propagated caste equality. Me here and you over there. Phule was also critical of the anti colonial nationalism that was preached by upper caste leaders. He wrote, "The Brahmins have hidden away the sword of their religion, which has cut the throat of people's prosperity, and now go about posing as great patriots of their country. They give this advice to our Shudra, Muslim, and Parsi youth that unless we put away all quarreling amongst ourselves about the divisions between high and low in our country and come together, our country will never make any progress. It will be unity to serve their purposes, and then it will be me here and you over there again." In 1873, Phule wrote a book named Gulamgiri, meaning slavery. Some 10 years before this, the American Civil War had been fought, leading to the end of slavery in America. Phule dedicated this book to all those Americans who had fought to free slaves, thus establishing a link between the conditions of the lower caste in India and the black slaves in America. As this example shows, Phule extended his criticism of the caste system to argue against all forms of inequality. He was concerned about the plight of upper caste women. the miseries of the laborer, and the humiliation of the low caste. This movement for caste reform was continued in the 20th century by other great Dalit leaders like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in Western India and E.V. Ramaswamy in the South, who could enter temples. Ambedkar was born into a Mahar family. As a child, he experienced what caste prejudice meant in everyday life. In school, he was forced to sit outside the classroom on the ground and was not allowed to drink water from taps that upper caste children used. After finishing school, he got a fellowship to go to the US for higher studies. On his return in India in 1919, he wrote extensively about upper caste power in contemporary society. In 1927, Ambedkar started a temple entry movement in which his Mahar caste followers participated. Brahman priests were outraged when the Dalits used water from the temple tank. Ambedkar led three such movements for temple entry between 1927 and 1935. His aim was to make everyone see the power of caste prejudices within society. The non Brahman movement. In the early 20th century, the non Brahman movement started. The initiative came from those non Brahman castes that had acquired access to education, wealth, and influence. They argued that Brahmins were heirs of Aryan invaders from the north who had conquered southern lands from the original inhabitants of the region, the indigenous Dravidian races. They also challenged Brahminical claims to power. E.V. Ramaswamy Periyar, as he was called, came from a middle class family. Interestingly, he had been an ascetic in his early life and had studied Sanskrit scriptures carefully. Later, he became a member of Congress only to leave it in disgust when he found that at a feast organized by nationalists, seating arrangements followed caste distinctions. That is, the lower caste were made to sit at a distance from the upper caste. Convinced that untouchables had to fight for their dignity, Periyar founded the self respect movement. He argued that untouchables were the true upholders of an original Tamil and Dravidian culture which had been subjugated by Brahmins. He felt that all religious authorities saw social divisions and inequality as God given. Untouchables had to free themselves, therefore, from all religions in order to achieve social equality. Periyar was an outspoken critic of Hindu scriptures, especially the codes of Manu, the ancient lawgiver, and Bhagavad Gita and Ramayana. He said that these texts had been used to establish the authority of Brahmins over lower caste and the domination of men over women. These assertions did not go unchallenged. The forceful speeches, writings, and movements of lower caste leaders did lead to rethinking and some self criticism among upper caste nationalist leaders. But Orthodox Hindu society also reacted by founding Sanatan Dharma Sabhas and the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal in the north. Associations like Brahman Sabha in Bengal were also established. The object of these associations was to uphold caste distinctions as a cornerstone of Hinduism and show how this was sanctified by scriptures. Debates and struggles over caste continued beyond the colonial period and are still going on in our own times. Periyar on women. Only with the arrival of words such as Thara Mukhurtham, our women had become puppets in the hands of their husbands. We ended up with such fathers who advised their daughters that they had been gifted away to their husbands and they belonged to their husband's place. This is the result of our association with Sanskrit. Organizing for reform. The Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj, formed in 1830, prohibited all forms of idolatry and sacrifice, believed in the Upanishads, and forbade its members from criticizing other religious practices. It critically drew upon the ideals of religions, especially of Hinduism and Christianity, looking at the negative and positive dimensions. Derozio and Young Bengal. Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, a teacher at Hindu College, Calcutta in the 1820s, promoted radical ideas and encouraged his pupils to question all authority. Referred to as the Young Bengal movement, his students attacked tradition and custom, demanded education for women, and campaigned for the freedom of thought and expression. The Ramakrishna Mission and Swami Vivekanand. Named after Ramakrishna Paramhans, Swami Vivekananda's guru, the Ramakrishna Mission stressed the ideal of salvation through social service and selfless action. Swami Vivekananda, whose original name was Narendranath Datta, combined the simple teachings of Sri Ramakrishna with his well founded modern outlook and spread them all over the world. After hearing him in the World Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893, the New York Herald reported, "We feel how foolish it is to send missionaries to this learned nation." Indeed, Swami Vivekananda was the first Indian in modern times who re established the spiritual preeminence of the Vedanta philosophy on a global scale. But his mission was not simply to talk of religion, he was extremely pained at the poverty and the misery of his countrymen. He firmly believed that any reform could become successful only by uplifting the condition of the masses. Therefore, his clarion call to the people of India was to rise above the narrow confines of the religion of the kitchen and come together in the service of the nation. By sending out this call, he made a signal contribution to the nascent nationalism of India. His sense of nationalism was, however, not narrow in its conception. He was convinced that many of the problems facing the mankind could only be overcome if the nations of the world come together on an equal footing. Therefore, his exhortation to the youth was to unite on the basis of common spiritual heritage. In his exhortation, he became truly the symbol of new spirit and a source of strength for the future. Pratna Samaj. Established in 1867 at Bombay, the Pratna Samaj sought to remove caste restrictions, abolish child marriage, encourage the education of women, and end the ban on widow remarriage. Its religious meetings drew upon Hindu, Buddhist, and Christian texts. The Veda Samaj, established in Madras, Chennai in 1864, the Veda Samaj was inspired by the Brahmo Samaj. It worked to abolish caste distinctions and promote widow remarriage and women's education. Its members believed in one God. They condemned the superstition and rituals of Orthodox Hinduism. The Aligarh movement. The Mohammedan Anglo Oriental College, founded by Sayyid Ahmad Khan in 1875 at Aligarh, later became the Aligarh Muslim University. The institution offered modern education, including Western science, to Muslims. The Aligarh movement, as it was known, had an enormous impact in the area of educational reform. The Singh Sabha movement. Reform organization of the first Singh Sabhas were formed at Amritsar in 1873 and at Lahore. In 1879, the Sabhas sought to rid Sikhism of superstitions, caste distinctions, and practices seen by them as non-Sikh. They promoted education among the Sikhs, often combining modern instruction with Sikh teachings.